Good morning.
Good morning, everyone.
So Michelle and I are going to talk to you about openness as a strategy for innovation. First, we're going to maybe tell you a little bit more about ourselves, where we come from, what we've done, to hopefully give you a little bit more context as to where we're coming from. As was just mentioned, I used to be the Director of Government Relations at Code for America. I left that position to take up a new role within city government in Philadelphia of Chief Data Officer. But before I worked at making the world a better place, I did work for different technology companies across the country.
And like Mark, I spent the first part of my career in the private sector in user experience design at eBay and then at Google. But after a while, I found myself, really enjoying my work there, and that was kind of a problem. You see, what I saw at Google was that the company was able to take everything to an art form, from the most mundane processes all the way to moonshots. Things like ticketing systems, the cafeteria, worked really, really well. And what I wanted to do was see if that kind of technology, that kind of point of view could be transported outside the Silicon Valley bubble and to the public sector. So 2 years ago, left my job, started the Code for America Fellowship based in San Francisco, working with the city of Philadelphia. And then a year ago, when the fellowship ended, we've actually spun out our work there into Textizen, which uses text messaging to connect cities and citizens across the country and across the world.
So what we're going to do is we're going to talk to you about openness as a strategy for enabling innovation and driving value. Now, Michelle and I are very passionate about civic technology, about making cities better, about making the world a better place, I guess, if that's not too corny. But we're not here to preach to you about making the world a better place, even though we hope you'll all do what you can to do that. We're here to talk about openness as a real strategy that any organization can use to enable innovation and to drive real value for that organization. And it works in all sorts of organizations. I work in a big, complex, siloed organization called city government. Michelle works in a nimble, new startup. So we've both seen these strategies work in a variety of different kinds of organizations. So whatever organization you're a part of, we're confident that these strategies can help you drive innovation. So one of my absolute favorite quotes is from Louis Pasteur, and it sort of speaks to the value of continuing to improve how you look at the world, your ability to do things. If you're builders like Michelle and myself, you're constantly refining your skills. And I think this applies a lot to innovation. He said, where observation is concerned, fortune or chance favors only the prepared mind. So in other words, you need to be ready for innovation when it occurs, to capitalize on it when it occurs. And it's this constant state of improvement that will make you ready to capitalize on an innovation when it occurs.
So we'll tell a few stories from businesses and organizations of all sizes. And the first I wanted to share is from Amazon. So in 2002, you may have heard this story, but Jeff Bezos issued his interoperability mandate. He said, number one, all the teams are now going to only expose data and functionality to each other through service interfaces. Number two, they must communicate with each other through these interfaces and only these interfaces. They must be designed from the ground up to be externizable. And then number five, anyone who doesn't do this will be fired. Thank you. Have a nice day. And a really remarkable thing happened. So all of the teams began to communicate and trade information and interface with each other through these interfaces. And then a few years later, it turns out that there's a lot more developer demand than just inside the company for these services. They launched Amazon Web Services. And then within 10 years of that initial mandate, AWS reaches $1.5 billion annual revenue based on these services that came kind of serendipitously from this initial mandate. The next story I'd like to share is that Google, in 2006, Google Docs and Spreadsheets launched. And this is where I think a really interesting default choice was made. Within the company, every single document and spreadsheet was set to anyone can view. Budgets, hiring, timelines, it was a I guess 7 years ago. It was a different company, but not that much different. And what started to happen was, one, it was a lot easier to start to share information across teams. You didn't necessarily have to make specific requests. But two, actual editing and collaboration, co-creation happened at an incredibly fast pace. And so in some cases, people were actually overwriting each other's content on spreadsheets, like you see in that example in the middle. And someone would be typing something, and the next person would actually be lined up to put something in that cell. They would overwrite it. This became a big problem. And so we looked at how we might solve this problem, maybe by locking cells before you were able to edit it, but that seemed cumbersome. And when we looked more deeply, we saw that actually most people, the vast majority of people, were just contributing little bits of information to a spreadsheet, not managing it, and they didn't actually need edit access to the whole thing. So by creating Google Forms, which is where we embed forms that feed data directly to a spreadsheet, sending those out through email, through web, we made using spreadsheets easier, opened it to more people, and created the fastest growing form of Google document. And that happened about 2 years after the initial Docs and Spreadsheets launch.
So I want to tell you a story from a nimble organization like city government. It's striking to me the experiences that we see with companies like Amazon, particularly Amazon, this idea that the company was going to build a service environment that was externizable, so they could turn these services into something that outside consumers could use. We've had sort of the inverse experience of that in city government. Now, many city governments, certainly the big ones like New York, Chicago, Boston, Philadelphia, San Francisco, are all adopting open data strategies. They're realizing that one of the most valuable assets they have is the data that they collect and curate. So we actually have a gas utility in the city of Philadelphia. It's municipally owned at the time, currently. We were having a conversation with them about open data and what we were trying to do, and they remarked to me that every year, once a year, they get a CD from our Office of Property Administration. When a new customer calls and says, I want to start my gas service, they need a data source to actually verify that address, and for a long time, it had been a CD that was generated for them that they got once a year. So we talked to them about a new API that they could use so they could automatically, in real time, verify their property information. Seems pretty basic, but it's actually just happening as part of our open data strategy. The really interesting thing when I talk about being ready to capitalize on innovation when it happens is during this discussion of open data, they mentioned to us, oh, hey, by the way, would you be interested, the city, in information we have on accounts where the name on the account changes with some frequency, maybe every 6 months, every 12 months, indicating probably a renter. Well, it turns out the city of Philadelphia issues rental licenses, and that's a revenue source for us. So we said, you bet we'd be interested in that if you can provide it for us. But what's really interesting is there's a built-in incentive for landlords. So it isn't just like the city's just come across some new revenue source, and now we're going to go out and extract money from people that otherwise weren't paying it. If you're a renter, or excuse me, if you're a landlord in the city and you rent, and that renter goes into arrears on their utility service, the utility company can put a lien against your property unless you have a rental license from the city of Philadelphia. Boom. We got an open data opportunity, we got a brand new revenue source for the city that needs it, and we got a built-in incentive for people to participate in it, and they get a real benefit out of it. So it was a really interesting story that we're using to now evangelize open data throughout our city and in other cities. This is something Michelle and I do both as a part of and in our extracurricular activities as a part of our jobs. But what's interesting about this is that in Amazon's case, they started to use this, this service-oriented approach with the idea that they would take these internal services and then face them outward. What we're experiencing in the municipal open data movement is the inverse of that. We're exposing our data through interfaces and APIs to external users, and we are now finding internal opportunities, other business units, other entities of government that say, hey, you have an API. Do you have API documentation? Yes, we do. Do you have code samples? Yes, we do. Do you have a forum where we can talk to other developers who are using your API? Yes, we do. So now we're innovating in that way.
And our last case study is kind of at the cusp of open data decisions. And Mark will talk in a moment about incentivizing openness. At Textizen, which is our business connecting citizens to government through text messaging and other mobile interfaces, What we've done very recently, just in the past couple of months, is provide an open data discount. If a city or partner pledges to make the collected data and information openly available to anyone through our platform, they can receive a discount. And in this age of tightening budgets and cash-strapped cities, who wouldn't opt for that decision? So we've had about 80% uptake so far. And one of the things it's enabled to do already, just in the past couple of months, is form relationships with universities and research groups studying this form of communication. So for a very small team, such as our startup, that's an invaluable resource in terms of bringing research and insight to the work we're doing. So all of these really are on this continuum. I think what you can see in all of these case studies is that a cultural change is made, either from the top down or from a more grassroots collaborative approach. But in any case, a cultural change happens sometime between 6 months and 4 years later across all of these cases. There's an innovative service or product released that could never have happened without that initial cultural change. And then it looks like between 1 and 6 years later, there's significant ROI, whether it's value from issuing business licenses, value from being able to sell and create a new stream of revenue from Amazon Web Services. So altogether, somewhere between 1.5 years and 10 years from the initial cultural change to a significant change in revenue based on these initial decisions.
So just to sort of summarize here, Michelle and I we're not here to preach that you need to make the world a better place, even though we hope you do your darndest to do that. We're here to talk about openness as a real driver of innovation and value. Openness creates an environment that's conducive to innovation. It brings together different ideas from different disciplines. Any organization can use this strategy. And I want to be clear on this. As Michelle said when she referenced the cultural change that's sort of the impetus to all this, this is the result of a deliberate strategy or a set of choices by organizational leadership. This can happen on its own, but it often doesn't. It requires someone to say, maybe not this strongly, but you'll be open or you'll be fired. It's, I guess that's the openness analogy of Cortez burning his ships.
I mean, in our case, it's you'll be open or you'll pay us a little more money.
There you go. So that's another incentivizer. But to be clear, this is the result of a deliberate strategy. And more organizations are doing this. Has anybody ever heard of programmable web? Programmable web is a website that actually lists APIs and data sources that entities of all kinds make available. They just passed their 10,000th listing. They list over 10,000 resources from companies and governments, large and small, around the world that are adopting this strategy of, if I make myself open and I engage with outside consumers or outside users, or I become a consumer of someone else's engagement strategy, I can drive value by fostering innovation. So this is sort of our reimagination of Louis Pasteur's note about fortune and who it favors. Where innovation is concerned, fortune favors the prepared organization. So what you need to ask yourselves is my organization prepared for innovation? And how will I capitalize on it when it happens? And our argument is that by being open and by engaging other people outside of your organization to interact with you, to be creative, and to help foster new ideas, you can drive value. We also want to be clear about the difference between simply being open and leveraging open. From my perspective, as someone who is a municipal chief data officer, it's more than simply saying we're going to be open. We're going to meet the legislative mandate to be open and transparent, which is something that I imagine is fairly tempting in the public sector. What we're talking about here is actually leveraging openness. If you're going to do that, then your data, your information, the thing that you are sharing needs to be described. What is it? People need to understand what it is. It needs to be clearly documented. People need to understand how to use it and what it means to them. Why should they use it? It needs to be discoverable. So people need to be able to find your resources, whether it's your data, some sort of API, or some other platform or service that you want to offer. And as we've said, I think repeatedly through this presentation, there needs to be a built-in incentive. Why are people going to use the thing that you want them to use? It needs to be more than simply, hey, come generate value for me. Come give me your good ideas. And I think if we look at all of those platforms and those companies that are really engaging with this in a very successful way, we see that there's a very clear incentive. It's very obvious to the people that are using these services and platforms. And I should also note too, we've talked about some of the cool kids, right? We've talked about Google, we've talked about Facebook. You can make this same observation of Twitter and Foursquare and some of these other companies, nimble startups like Textizen. But it isn't just them. This is companies of all kinds. You want to check the weather or your sports scores? There's an API for that. You want to custom program your car? Guess what? There's an API for that. We're increasingly seeing all kinds of companies embrace this strategy as a way to drive new ideas, innovation, and value. So that's our story, and we're sticking to it. Does anybody have any questions? Does anybody want to challenge the assertions that we're making? You realize that by not raising your hand, you're tacitly agreeing with everything we've just said.
Here in the front and middle.
Hi, my question is more towards city government. There's a lot of, just to pick an example of where there can be a problem, or at least that there's talk of problems with openness, is things like anti-terrorism or anti-theft. Frequently, you can aggregate information across 5, 6, 8 totally disconnected systems, like you mentioned, the gas system, and suddenly have a really good map of, if you wanted to do significant damage to Philadelphia. How do you deal with, when you have, open by default, not accidentally across 8 or 10 systems creating a really good map of something you wouldn't necessarily want to have open?
Sure. No, it's a great question, particularly as it relates to government information. So I think the answer is not a clear one, but it's part of the culture of openness that you need to create involves a maturation process, becoming good stewards of data, releasing data that you know is valuable and that people want and that can benefit you, but being mindful of some data that is not suitable for public consumption. This isn't just something that's reserved to government. A private company that wanted to release data to spur developers to do something innovative and unique with it would need to be mindful of this as well. And I always like to say that there isn't a good replacement for experience. So when I am asked about how to get started with openness, whether it's a municipal government or a state government or a private company, I often say start small and scale fast. So pick low-hanging fruit, pick things you know people want that aren't sensitive, and build your culture around that, build your processes around that. There are inevitably little speed bumps along the way, but once you get experienced with building openness and reaching out and engaging people, you build out your processes, you become more experienced, and hopefully that doesn't happen. In back?
How do you get the reluctant participants to get on board with you? So the people who have the data that you want, perhaps.
You want to take that one?
Sure. That's a great question. So in some cases, the incentives come from the top. They're quite strong. And often what has spurred that edict from above is an example of how useful it can be. So if you're aiming at a particular data set, you might, your request for that data set to be released might not be as successful as saying, look at this other data set. When it was released, here's what happened to it. And actually, this is what happened in the city of Philadelphia that led to the Open Data Executive Order. I think SEPTA, which is the Regional Transit Agency, was one of the leaders in releasing data, creating a culture of developer collaboration, had a mailing list that was very active with local developers, improved the API to the point where I believe it was 2 years after the initial release, Mayor came by a hackathon and saw 10 teams at work building all different sorts of projects, being able to look up timetables using the Connect game, looking at real-time transit status, a whole host of other valuable things. And that was one of the, and I believe he said, how do we get more of this? And his staff said, well, there's that order on your desk that we've been trying to get you to sign for a while.
Sometimes this can be really practical too, right? So Michelle and I were looking at the ESPN has a really awesome developer center, which kind of surprised me when I first learned about it. But it doesn't surprise me that ESPN wants to share the data about teams and athletes and scorers, because I'm positive there were people scraping that off their website for a long, long time. So very pragmatically, if I'm the administrator of web infrastructure, I don't want people writing scrapers that are gonna pound the heck out of my servers. I'd rather give them data, give them an API key, know who they are, know how they're using it. But I can guarantee you this exact experience happened with our transit authority. People were scraping data off their website. It would occasionally bring down their servers when somebody maybe had a for loop that didn't break out soon enough. I'm sure that ESPN had that same experience, and a lot of companies have that. They have data that they present on their web pages or that they hide inside of some report or document, and the process of extraction can be expensive on your web infrastructure. So just from a very pragmatic standpoint, that's a really good way to start sharing data. Make your life easier.
I think every stakeholder, every owner will have their own incentives, so look for the right incentives and play to that. And I think we're out of time, so thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Have a great day.